This is still a mystery to us. The discussion of the entire incident is going to need the 3 living witnesses to be absolutely fucking drunk. My mom was in her early 40s, my brother was 10, and my grandma, her mother, was in her 60s when I was 7. So, we were all coherent. Nobody was too young or too old to remember this absurdity. Despite this, we still have no bloody answers. Grandma lived on a secluded country road in North Carolina that was named after her family, since they were the only crazy people to occupy the roughly 1,000 acres of property there. I really do mean crazy. You remember that time Uncle Bob was in the ditch with a shotgun? Is the opening line of many of our family history tales. Her house had been empty for several weeks while she had been visiting us in Florida, but now we were all back, spending the weekend with her before returning home. The house is in the country, literally over train tracks past a salvage yard, and her nearest neighbor, a cousin, everyone who owns a house on the road is related, is only a screaming distance away. Yes, that seems to be accurate. A screaming distance. It's early in the morning, like just before dawn. We're awake because these are farm freaks that get up at the crack of dawn out of pure habit. We're having cereal for breakfast, and suddenly we hear a car pull up. We all rush to the large picture window that overlooks the front yard. There's an odd truck out there. Even though the motor is idle, no one appears to be behind the wheel. For one thing, the truck is, well, old. It's vintage, perhaps from the 1930s. It's rusty now, but it was certainly once painted blue. A loud, insistent knocking on the front door occurs all at once. We're all screaming. My grandmother, who is incredibly resourceful, gathers us all in the living room away from a window where anyone may see us. Then, as my mother, brother, and I tremble on the couch, she takes a serrated bread knife from the kitchen and cautiously approaches the front door. She slowly peeks out a side window. She returns her gaze to us, puzzled. She shakes her head as if to say, "No one is there. We can all breathe a little easier now." Then every freaking door in the house starts banging, non-stop, rhythmic and frightening, as if all the doors are about to shatter and crack. Because there were 2 doors beneath us in the basement, the sound is also reverberating at our feet. From our vantage position on the couch, we can see the 3 ground floor doors wobbling and jerking on their hinges. Mom finally dashes to the window, whether from a psychotic break with reality or fright, I'm not sure. "Oh, thank Christ, cousin is here," she cries. We rush to her and peek out the picture window. We discover no one in the yard that we can see, but we can't see all of the doors from our viewpoint. Cousin approaches the truck, holding a shotgun. He appears bewildered as he looks at the back of the truck. Then he looks in the cab window and comes to a halt. He becomes pale and runs his hand down his face. Then he runs towards us, towards our house. When my grandmother sees him approaching, she flings open the kitchen door. "Everyone get behind the couch," he yells. As we rush for the couch, he runs by us. The bashing resumes, all the doors slamming and the windows rattling. We're too terrified to even scream. Cousin flings open the front door and shoots the massive shotgun with a thunderous bang. As he does so, the truck roars to life, making a train-like sound. We scramble up. The banging, thankfully, stops. Cousin is making his way onto the yard, shotgun aimed towards the truck. We chase after him, desperate to get out of that shaking, quivering house and close to the dude with the gun. The vehicle accelerates backwards, cutting across the yard at breakneck speed. Tires screech and rubber burns. Cousin opens fire again, and we all flee behind him. He blasts out the back glass, making the sound of 1,000 dishes slamming onto the linoleum, yet the truck never hiccups, it just roars down the road. There were no tags or even a vanity plate on the rear. That thing had no one behind the wheel. We could all see clearly. Everyone was in agreement. There was no driver in the cab. In any case, nothing we could see. The cops were called. Cousin had to walk home to call. This was before cell phones. The phone line had been severed. There wasn't a single boot print in the yard except Cousin's, from where he'd rushed into and out of the house. He stated that there was no license plate, but when he glanced inside the cab, it appeared to be something out of a horror movie. He claimed there were strange bindings, handcuffs, seat clamps, nylon straps, and that the floorboards smelled like blood. He said he thought he saw a blur out the window and ran to fire the first shot, but missed because nothing or no one was on the lawn or in the truck. Grandma and cousin are no longer with us. They were deeply devout people who clung to their unchanging versions of the story until they died. My brother, mother, and I were never able to figure it out, and I believe the cops were also unable to solve the mystery. I moved in with a now ex-boyfriend in the early 2000s. He resided in a bungalow-style house in a suburb of a large Midwestern metropolis. This occurred when I took a personal day from work after moving in to complete arranging and unpacking my belongings. The doorbell rang in the middle of the afternoon. I noticed a modestly dressed woman through the peephole. My guess was Jehovah's Witness, so I decided to ignore it and go back to unpacking. I opened the door so I could get a better look. The woman was approximately my age, in her late 20s, and she had frizzy hair from a bad perm. It was a dull brownish blonde that appeared dry and damaged. Her entire wardrobe was reminiscent of a conventional granny. She was dressed in a lightweight brown jacket, a white turtleneck that appeared to have been washed several times, a long khaki skirt with a button up front, and loafers that looked like moccasins. She was underdressed for a late November day. The only thing that broke from her sense of style were her sparkling black aviator sunglasses. I couldn't see her eyes. I opened the front door but kept the screen door closed. She asked if my boyfriend was at home. I started to claim he wasn't home, but my instincts kicked in. When I asked what she wanted, she pulled up a foil-wrapped paper plate. I made this for him, just wanted to thank him for his assistance the other day. That nearly made sense. He was a firefighter, and he'd recently been called to a house, but why would she bring these to his house? How did she come across his house? Why was I immediately uneasy and terrified as I opened the door? I told her that she would have to give it to him at work. She asked if he was at work. I explained to her she'd need to talk to him later at work. Again, she asked when he'd be home. I told her she'd need to speak with him. She'd ask if he was home, and so on. It was like an endless loop. I noticed she spoke in a jerky manner, as if she had to move physically in order to speak. Finally, I interrupted the cycle by telling her I couldn't talk to her any longer and that she'd have to leave. As I shut the door, she slapped her hand on the screen door and yelled, "No!" I hurriedly shut and locked the door. There was a knock at the back door almost immediately. That didn't make sense because the backyard was gated and the gate was always locked. The lot was long and narrow, so getting from the front to the back took some time due to the locked gate. I dashed to the back and peered out the window. There she was and was now yelling that she knew he was home and that I had to let her in. I peered out the back door at her. She definitely had a problem, and I wasn't sure if calling 911 was the best approach for getting help. As I was looking at her, the doorbell rang. Hopefully, it was someone else. I went to check through the peephole. She had reappeared. She smiled at me, and the knocking began at the back of the house. I rushed over to the phone. Because there were two of them, I was certain that this was a crime and that she was acting. My best bet was to dial 911. The phone rang as I approached it. I expected it to be her, but it was our next-door neighbors. They were a little older, but not by much. He was a retired cop, and his wife worked at a city office. She had off today and was wondering if we wanted to come over for dinner. I cut her off, scared, and asked as to if someone was at my front door. I urged her to double-check, and she replied, "No." I explained why when she asked. She immediately dialed her husband's number. He said he'd be right over and sent me to the interior of the house, away from the windows. Throughout this time, the front bell rung and there was knocking in the back. It eventually came to an end. He yelled at the front door that it was him and that I could open the door. He asked me a lot of questions, and then we had this conversation that I'll never forget. If that thing ever comes back again, don't open the door. If she ever comes back, I'm calling the police. Wait, what do you mean by that thing? I'm not sure what religion you follow, but you should get something to protect yourself and hang it by the door. Also, don't bring it up again. My boyfriend was just as puzzled as I was, and he couldn't recognize her from my description. We talked about it at first, but after he talked to Tom one day, I realized he didn't want to talk about it anymore. He was raised as a Catholic, and he placed a crucifix near the door a few days later. He insisted it was merely something he'd held for a long time from his grandmother's house that reminded him of her. Nothing else happened while I was there for a little over a year. My ex-boyfriend called me at work about a year after I moved out. He assumed I'd be interested in learning Tom had died. We talked about previous times and how Tom had been worried about me following the event during the conversation. The same thing had happened to Tom's widow late one night after their first child had been born. I tried to push it past Tom's concern, but he claimed Tom had asked him not to discuss it and he wanted to respect that. I've lost contact with both of them since then. It wasn't until a few days later that I realized what had happened. Tom and his wife were the same age as my parents. Their first child is a few years older than me. That implies that she had a similar situation back in the 1970s. It's still a mystery to me.